the opulent rose gardens of a Viennese estate, a glamorous heiress lies dead. A jewelled hairpin in her heart, her diamonds vanished. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, invited to a glittering gathering of diplomats, artists and secrets. As whispers of blackmail, betrayal and a deadly toxin trade unravel, Miss Marple uncovers a web of greed and family shadows, where every rose hides a thorn and a killer. Will she untangle the truth before another falls? Murder in the Rose Gardens of Vienna, a mystery where beauty masks betrayal. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Vienna. In the tranquil village of Chipping Barrows, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer's bounty, and the church clock chimed with predictable precision, Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour, a haven of chintz and polished mahogany. The morning sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting delicate filigrees across the well-worn rug. On the table beside her, a bone china teacup rested, its contents cooling as she studied a letter held lightly in her small, capable hands. The envelope bore a foreign postmark, and the paper within was thick, cream-coloured, inscribed with the elegant looping script of Lady Beatrice Ashford, a friend from her school days at the Florence Court Academy. "My dear Jane," the letter began, "I find myself in Vienna, ensconced in the splendour of Baroness Clara von Hohenberg's estate, famed for its rose gardens, which rival Eden itself. The Baroness is hosting a gathering, a week of music, conversation, and diplomacy. The guest list is a tapestry of the curious and the distinguished, diplomats, artists, and others whose motives are not always clear. I thought of you at once. Your quiet wisdom sees what others overlook. Do join us, Jane. It promises to be an affair to remember." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite the gentle creases framing them, lingered on the final sentence. Beatrice was not given to overstatement, yet her words carried a subtle note of disquiet, like a minor chord in an otherwise cheerful melody. Miss Marple folded the letter, her mind already turning. A trip abroad was no small undertaking for a spinster of her years, but her curiosity, that indefatigable spark, stirred. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and began to plan. A modest suitcase was packed with sensible dresses, a single evening gown of understated elegance, and her ever-present knitting bag. By the following morning, she had secured passage to Vienna, her heart light with the prospect of unravelling whatever lay beneath Beatrice's invitation. The journey was uneventful, save for the chatter of a fellow passenger, a young clerk who prattled about Viennese waltzes and pastries. Miss Marple listened politely, her thoughts elsewhere, until the train pulled into Vienna's grand station, its arches soaring like the ambitions of the city itself. A chauffeur in crisp livery awaited her, whisking her through cobbled streets to the Baroness's estate on the city's outskirts. As the car wound up a tree-lined drive, Miss Marple caught her first glimpse of the mansion. A Baroque masterpiece of pale stone, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Beyond it stretched the famed rose gardens, their blooms a riot of crimson, ivory, and blush pink, their fragrance drifting on the breeze. The Baroness Clara von Hohenberg greeted her guests in the grand hall, where a chandelier sparkled like a constellation above marble floors. She was a woman of striking presence, tall and statuesque, her silver-streaked hair swept into an impeccable chignon. Her smile was gracious, but her grey eyes held a cool, appraising quality. as if weighing each guest's worth. Miss Marple, introduced by Lady Beatrice, felt the Baroness's gaze linger a moment too long, though she returned it with her usual serene nod. The guests were a diverse assembly, each a character in what Miss Marple sensed might become a complex drama. There was Ivan Rostov, a Russian émigré pianist with soulful eyes and a nervous habit of flexing his fingers as if yearning for his instrument. Sir Henry Caldwell, a British diplomat with a clipped moustache and an air of self-importance, spoke in measured tones that hinted at secrets. Lillian Carver, an American heiress dazzled in a silk gown, her laughter bright but her eyes calculating. Dr. Felix Gruber, an Austrian botanist, was reserved, his spectacles glinting as he murmured about hybrid roses. Lastly, Karl von Hohenberg, the Baroness's nephew, a young artist with a brooding intensity, sketched absently in a corner, his pencil tracing the curves of a rose. That evening, as the guests gathered for cocktails in a salon adorned with frescoes, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting needles clicking softly. She observed the undercurrents. Sir Henry's stiff smile as Lillian teased him about a recent embassy scandal. Ivan's sharp glance at Dr. Gruber when the conversation turned to rare plants. Karl's fleeting scowl when his aunt praised his late father's contributions to the estate. The Baroness moved among them, her poise unshakable, yet Miss Marple noted how her fingers tightened around her glass when Lillian's laughter rang out. As the group adjourned to the terrace, overlooking the rose gardens aglow in the twilight, Miss Marple lingered by a window. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, but there was something else. A faint tension, like the hush before a storm. She recalled Beatrice's letter, its veiled unease. An affair to remember, Beatrice had written. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. In her experience, such affairs often held more than music and roses. She sipped her sherry, her eyes missing nothing, as the first threads of a mystery began to weave themselves in her mind. Chapter 2. The Scent of Suspicion. The dining room of Baroness Clara von Hohenberg's Viennese estate gleamed with old-world grandeur. Its long, mahogany table set with crystal and silver that caught the flicker of candlelight. The rose gardens beyond the tall windows cast their fragrance into the room, mingling with the aroma of roasted pheasant and fine claret. Miss Jane Marple, seated between Lady Beatrice Ashford and the reserved Dr. Felix Gruber, observed the assembled company with her customary quiet attention. Her simple black dress and pearl brooch contrasted sharply with the opulence around her, yet her presence was unobtrusive, her pale blue eyes missing nothing. The conversation at dinner was lively, but beneath the polished banter ran a current of discord. Sir Henry Caldwell, the British diplomat, held forth on trade agreements with a pompous air, his voice carrying over the clink of cutlery. Ivan Rostov, the Russian pianist, interrupted with a passionate defense of cultural exchange, his dark eyes flashing. "Art transcends borders," he declared, his accent lending a musical lilt to his words. Sir Henry raised an eyebrow, his moustache twitching, and countered with a pointed remark about émigrés and their loyalties. The table fell briefly silent, the tension palpable. Lillian Carver, the American heiress, broke the moment with a laugh, her diamonds sparkling as she leaned toward Karl von Hohenberg, the Baroness's nephew. "Oh, Sir Henry, must we talk politics? I'd rather hear about Karl's paintings. Those roses of yours are divine, Karl, almost as captivating as you." Her voice was honeyed, but her green eyes held a glint of mischief. Carl, pale and intense, flushed at the compliment, his fingers tightening around his wineglass. The Baroness at the head of the table smiled thinly, her gaze flickering to Lillian with a coolness that Miss Marple noted at once. The Baroness herself was a study in control, her silver-streaked hair gleaming under the chandelier, her silk gown rustling as she directed the conversation to her prized rose gardens. "We have cultivated a new hybrid this season," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Dr. Gruber has been indispensable in its development." Dr. Gruber, seated beside Miss Marple, inclined his head modestly, but his spectacles caught the light, hiding his eyes. Miss Marple, making polite inquiries about rose cultivation, sensed his reticence when she mentioned rare plant varieties. "They require such care," he murmured, quickly changing the subject. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She noticed Ivan's fingers, restless without a piano, tapping an erratic rhythm on the tablecloth. She saw Carl's jaw tighten when the Baroness spoke of his late father, her brother, whose legacy loomed large over the estate. Lillian's flirtations with Carl were relentless, her laughter cutting through the room. Yet Miss Marple caught a fleeting look of disdain when Sir Henry mentioned a recent diplomatic scandal involving an American financier. There was history there, she thought, filing it away. After dinner, the guests adjourned to the terrace for coffee, the rose gardens a shadowed tapestry under the moon. Miss Marple, declining a liqueur, wandered to the edge of the garden, her shawl drawn about her shoulders against the evening chill. The air was heavy with the scent of roses, but another odour lingered, a faint acrid note that seemed out of place. She paused near a bed of crimson blooms, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. Bending as if to admire a flower, she noted footprints in the soil, deep and uneven, as if someone had stood there in haste. Her thoughts were interrupted by hushed voices from a nearby arbour, cloaked in ivy. She stepped closer, her movements silent, and caught fragments of a conversation between Ivan Rostov and Dr. Gruber. "The shipment must be secured," Ivan whispered, his voice taut. "If she finds out, it's over." Dr. Gruber's reply was softer, almost inaudible. "Keep it hidden. No one suspects." Miss Marple retreated, her heart quickening. "A shipment? Hidden where?" Her mind, trained by years of village intrigues, began to weave possibilities. Returning to the terrace, she rejoined Lady Beatrice, who was sipping coffee and watching the guests with her own keen interest. "A lively group, Jane," Beatrice remarked, her voice low, "but not entirely harmonious, I think." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. "People are rarely as they seem, Beatrice," she said. "There's a pattern here, but it's not yet clear." The evening drew to a close, and the guests began to retire. Miss Marple, lingering in the salon, overheard Lillian teasing Carl about his devotion to his aunt. "You're tied to her apron strings, darling," Lillian said, her tone playful but edged with cruelty. Carl's face darkened, and he excused himself abruptly, disappearing toward the gardens. The Baroness, standing nearby, watched him go, her expression unreadable. It was well past midnight when a scream pierced the stillness of the estate. Miss Marple, still awake in her room, her knitting abandoned, hurried to her window. The sound had come from the rose gardens. She donned her dressing gown and joined the other guests who were already rushing down the grand staircase, their faces pale with alarm. Sir Henry, in a hastily tied robe, led the way, his usual pomposity replaced by urgency. The Baroness followed, her composure fraying at the edges. In the gardens, beneath a trellis heavy with roses, they found Lillian Carver. She lay sprawled among the crimson blooms, her silk gown stained dark, a jewelled hairpin, its design unmistakably from the Baroness's collection, protruding from her chest. Her diamonds, so dazzling at dinner, were gone. Beside her, a single rose lay, its stem snapped clean through, as if in anger. Ivan Rostov gasped, his hands trembling. Karl stared, his face ashen. Dr. Gruber stood frozen, his spectacles reflecting the moonlight. The Baroness clutched her shawl, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple knelt briefly, her eyes taking in the scene. The disturbed earth, the snapped rose, the hairpin's precise placement. She rose, her expression serene, but her mind racing. This was no random act, she thought. The hairpin, the missing diamonds, the broken rose, they spoke of intent, of passion, of a story yet to be unravelled. As the guests retreated, whispering in shock, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze sweeping the garden. The acrid odour she had noticed earlier was stronger here, mingling with the rose's sweetness. She thought of Ivan's whispered words, of Dr. Gruber's evasiveness, of Karl's anger, and of the Baroness's cool control. Lady Beatrice joined her, her face pale. "Jane, this is dreadful," she said. "Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her room, began to click again, a steady rhythm in the chaos. "Someone with a secret, Beatrice," she said softly, "and secrets, like roses, have a way of revealing their thorns." She turned her gaze to the darkened garden, where the shadows seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her to uncover their truths. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Arrival. The morning sun rose over the Baroness von Hohenberg's estate, its golden light doing little to dispel the chill that had settled over the household. The rose gardens, so enchanting the previous evening, now seemed to mock the tragedy with their vibrant blooms. Miss Jane Marple, awake early despite the late-night commotion, sat by her bedroom window, her knitting untouched, as she gazed at the scene below. Servants moved quietly, their faces drawn, while the guests remained cloistered in their rooms, no doubt grappling with the shock of Lillian Carver's death. A police car arrived shortly after breakfast, its tires crunching on the gravel drive. From it emerged Inspector Wolfgang Klein, a lean man in his 40s with a meticulously waxed moustache and an air of disciplined efficiency. His dark suit was immaculate, and his sharp grey eyes scanned the estate as if cataloguing every detail. The Baroness greeted him in the grand hall, her composure restored, though Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, noted the slight tremor in her hand as she gestured toward the drawing room. Inspector Klein gathered the guests and key staff in the drawing room, a cavernous space adorned with tapestries and a grand fireplace. The atmosphere was heavy with unease. Sir Henry Caldwell sat stiffly, his diplomatic poise strained. Ivan Rostov's fingers twitched, as if seeking solace in music. Karl von Hohenberg, pale and dishevelled, avoided his aunt's gaze, and Dr. Felix Gruber adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, a nervous tic that Miss Marple found telling. Lady Beatrice, seated beside Miss Marple, whispered, "He looks formidable, Jane. I hope he's as clever as he seems." The inspector began his inquiry with crisp authority. his Viennese accent softened by years abroad. "Fräulein Carver's death is a tragedy," he said, his voice measured. "We are treating it as murder." The jeweled hairpin, identified by the Baroness as part of her collection, was the weapon. Her diamonds are missing, suggesting theft, but the precision of the wound raises questions. "I will need your accounts of last night." Sir Henry was the first to speak, his tone clipped. "Lillian was a nuisance, Inspector. She had a knack for collecting secrets. She hinted at knowing something about my work, a minor indiscretion at the embassy. I was in my room after dinner, writing letters." His alibi was unverified, and Miss Marple noted the faint sweat on his brow despite the cool room. Ivan Rostov followed, his voice low. "She mocked my music, said it was passé. I was angry, yes, but I went to the music room after dinner to practice, alone." His dark eyes darted to Dr. Gruber, who looked away. Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, clicked softly, a rhythm to her thoughts. Ivan's solitude was convenient, she mused, and his earlier talk of shipments lingered in her mind. Karl von Hohenberg's account was brief, his voice tight. "I was in my studio sketching. I often work late. I didn't see Lillian after dinner." His hands, stained with charcoal, trembled slightly. Miss Marple recalled his flushed reaction to Lillian's teasing and wondered what else he might be hiding. Dr. Gruber claimed to have retired early, citing fatigue from his botanical work. "I was in my room by 10, he said, his voice steady, but his fingers fidgeting with a pen. The Baroness, last to speak, was adamant. "This was a robbery, Inspector. Lillian's diamonds were valuable. Some outsider must have slipped into the gardens." Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality, as if she were eager to close the matter. Inspector Klein nodded, his expression unreadable, and dismissed the guests, requesting they remain on the estate. Miss Marple, lingering as the others dispersed, approached him with her characteristic diffidence. "Inspector, might I offer an observation?" she asked, her voice mild. Klein, surprised but polite, inclined his head. "The snapped rose beside Miss Carver," she continued. "It seems deliberate, don't you think? Not the act of a hurried thief." Klein's eyes narrowed, but he thanked her and turned to confer with his men. Miss Marple slipped away to the rose gardens, her sensible shoes treading lightly on the paths. The spot where Lillian had fallen was cordoned off, but she circled nearby, her eyes scanning the earth. The footprints she had noticed last night were still visible, deeper than expected for a casual stroll, and a faint chemical odour, sharp, almost medicinal, hung in the air. She knelt, ostensibly to adjust her shawl, and examined the soil. A small crushed leaf, unlike the rose's glossy foliage, caught her attention. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her mind turning to Dr. Gruber's botanical expertise. At luncheon, the mood was sombre. Sir Henry ate little, his gaze fixed on the window. Ivan excused himself early, muttering about needing air. Karl was absent, and the Baroness, presiding over the meal, spoke of resuming the week's festivities once this unpleasantness is resolved. Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, conversed with Beatrice about the gardens, steering the topic to rare plants. "Dr. Gruber must be quite skilled," she remarked. "Such knowledge could be dangerous, don't you think?" Beatrice frowned, then leaned closer. "He was involved in a scandal years ago, Jane. Something about unorthodox experiments. The university dismissed him." This confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The chemical odour, the crushed leaf, Gruber's evasiveness, all pointed to something beyond roses. She recalled the whispered exchange between Ivan and Gruber in the arbour, their talk of hiding something. Was Lillian's death tied to their secret? And why the Baroness's insistence on robbery? That afternoon, Miss Marple joined a tour of the gardens led by the Baroness, who spoke with pride about her hybrids. The guests subdued followed, but Miss Marple lagged behind, her eyes on a secluded arbour where the footprints had led. A faint scuff mark on a stone bench suggested someone had sat there recently, perhaps watching the house. She made a mental note to investigate further. As dusk fell, a maid approached Miss Marple in the library, where she was perusing a book on botany. "Miss, there's something odd," the girl whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "I saw Herr Karl near the garden shed last night, before the scream. He looked furtive." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. The shed, locked and off-limits to guests, was near the murder site. What had Karl been doing there? Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. The snapped rose, the hairpin, the missing diamonds, they were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was incomplete. Lillian had been a threat, her blackmailing hinted at by Sir Henry, her mockery wounding Ivan, her flirtations provoking Karl. Yet the chemical odour and Gruber's past suggested a deeper motive, one perhaps tied to the estate itself. And the Baroness, her cool insistence on robbery, felt like a veil over something darker. As the evening bell rang for dinner, Miss Marple rose, her expression serene but her resolve firm. "People talk, even when they don't mean to," she murmured to herself, recalling a similar case in Chipping Barrows. The rose gardens held secrets, and she was determined to unearth them, thorn by thorn. Chapter 4. A Botanist's Secret. The morning following Inspector Klein's arrival brought a deceptive calm to the Baroness von Hohenberg's estate, as if the rose gardens, bathed in soft sunlight, sought to erase the memory of Lillian Carver's death. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not so easily swayed by beauty. She sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with exotic plants, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she observed the household. The guests, though subdued, went through the motions of civility, but their eyes betrayed unease. Glances darted, conversations faltered. Miss Marple, ever the silent observer, sensed the threads of suspicion tightening. Dr. Felix Gruber, the Austrian botanist, had caught her attention from the start. His quiet demeanour, offset by the nervous flicker behind his spectacles, suggested a man guarding more than horticultural knowledge. At breakfast he had spoken sparingly, his responses to the Baroness's praise of his work clipped and evasive. Miss Marple, adept at drawing out the reticent, resolved to engage him. She found him later in the rose gardens, examining a hybrid bloom with a magnifying glass, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good morning, Dr. Gruber," she said, her voice gentle as she approached, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "These roses are remarkable. You must have a rare skill to coax such beauty from nature." Gruber started slightly, his magnifying glass slipping in his hand. "Oh, Miss Marple," he replied, recovering, "it's merely patience and science. Roses are predictable if you understand their needs." His smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted how his fingers lingered on the stem, as if reluctant to let go. She pressed further, her tone disarming. "I've always admired those who work with plants. In Chipping Barrows, our gardening club experiments with herbs, but nothing so grand as your hybrids. Do you ever work with rarer species? Perhaps those with unusual properties?" Gruber's eyes narrowed, and he adjusted his spectacles. "Roses are my focus," he said quickly. "Other plants are less reliable." He excused himself, citing a need to check his notes. But Miss Marple saw him glance toward a greenhouse at the garden's edge, its windows obscured by heavy blinds. Her curiosity deepened. The chemical odor near Lillian's body, the crushed leaf she had tucked into her handkerchief, and now Gruber's unease. They formed a pattern, faint but persistent. She recalled Lady Beatrice's mention of Gruber's dismissal from a university for unethical experiments. "Poison," Beatrice had said. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the jewelled hairpin, its precise placement in Lillian's chest. Could it have delivered more than a physical wound? At afternoon tea, served in the drawing room, Miss Marple sat beside Lady Beatrice, who was eager to share gossip. "Jane, I've remembered more about Gruber," Beatrice whispered, her cup clinking softly against its saucer. "He was experimenting with plant toxins. Something about extracting alkaloids for medicinal use, but it went too far. The university hushed it up, but he was disgraced." Miss Marple nodded, her expression placid but her mind racing. Alkaloids could be deadly, and the chemical scent in the garden suggested a toxin beyond ordinary gardening. Later, as the guests dispersed, Miss Marple took a solitary walk through the estate's grounds, her steps leading her to the greenhouse Gruber had eyed. The door was locked, but through a gap in the blinds, she glimpsed shelves lined with vials and jars, their labels obscured. A faint whiff of that same acrid odor escaped the ventilation, confirming her suspicions. As she turned away, she saw Gruber emerge from a side path, a small glass vial tucked into his palm. He froze upon seeing her, then forced a smile. "Just checking soil samples," he said, hurrying off. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, noting the haste in his step. The day wore on, and the estate's atmosphere grew heavier. Sir Henry Caldwell received a note at dinner, slipped under his plate by an unseen hand. He read it, his face paling, and crumpled it into his pocket. Miss Marple, seated across from him, caught the words "Leave Vienna" before he concealed it. "A prank," he muttered when Lady Beatrice inquired, but his hand shook as he reached for his wine. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her shawl, observed Ivan Rostov watching Sir Henry with a guarded expression, while Karl von Hohenberg, silent at the table's end, stared into his plate. That evening, the Baroness hosted a small musicale in the salon, perhaps to restore normalcy. Even performed a haunting Chopin nocturne, his fingers coaxing sorrow from the keys. Miss Marple, seated in a corner, watched the guests. The Baroness sat rigidly, her eyes fixed on Ivan, while Karl sketched absently in a notebook, his pencil tracing the same rose pattern Miss Marple had noticed before, geometric, almost mechanical. Dr. Gruber, absent for much of the evening, slipped in late, his face flushed. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving a tapestry of clues: the vial, the note, the rose patterns, the chemical scent. After the recital, she lingered in the salon, ostensibly to admire a painting. A maid clearing glasses hesitated near her. "Miss, I shouldn't say, but I saw Dr. Gruber in the greenhouse late last night. After it happened," she whispered. He was burning papers. Miss Marple thanked her softly, her mind turning to the greenhouse's contents. Burning papers suggested concealment, and concealment pointed to guilt or fear. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple paused by a window overlooking the gardens. The moonlight silvered the roses, but their beauty now seemed a mask for something sinister. She thought of Lillian's blackmailing habits, hinted at by Sir Henry, and Ivan's whispered talk of shipments with Gruber. The threatening note to Sir Henry, the locked greenhouse, Carl's furtive behaviour near the shed, all were pieces of a puzzle. But the key lay with Gruber's expertise. A toxin, perhaps, delivered by the hairpin. And what of the Baroness, whose calm seemed too perfect, too practised? Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, her knitting set aside. She drew out the crushed leaf from her handkerchief, its edges brittle and faintly discoloured. It was no rose leaf, she was certain. Tomorrow, she would find a way to learn more about Gruber's work, perhaps by engaging him again, or exploring the greenhouse's secrets. For now, she opened her notebook, jotting down her observations in her neat, precise hand. People hide what they fear to lose, she murmured, recalling a similar case in Chipping Barrows, where a gardener's pride had masked a deadly ambition. The estate slept, but Miss Marple's mind did not. The rose gardens, with their intoxicating scent, held a darker truth, and she was determined to uncover it, petal by petal, before another thorn drew blood. Chapter 5. The Pianist's Past. The third day at Baroness von Hohenberg's estate dawned with a mist that clung to the rose gardens, softening their vivid colours into a dreamlike haze. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat in the conservatory with a cup of tea, her knitting needles idle as she watched the morning unfold. The household was subdued, the guests moving with the cautious deliberation of those aware they were under scrutiny. Inspector Klein's presence lingered like a shadow, his officers quietly combing the grounds for clues to Lillian Carver's murder. Yet Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, sensed that the answers lay not in footprints or stolen diamonds, but in the secrets the guests carried. Even Rostov, the Russian pianist, had piqued her interest. His passionate performance at the previous evening's musicale had captivated the room, but Miss Marple had noticed his hands trembling as he left the piano, his face pale beneath its usual intensity. There was a story there, she thought, one tied to his cryptic exchange with Dr. Gruber about shipments and the need to keep them hidden. Determined to learn more, she sought him out after breakfast, finding him in the music room, his fingers tracing silent melodies on the grand piano's keys. "Good morning, Mr. Rostov," she said, her voice soft as she settled into a chair near the piano, her knitting bag at her side. "Your Chopin last night was quite moving. My nephew Raymond is quite fond of the nocturnes." Ivan's dark eyes softened, and he offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Music is a refuge sometimes." His accent was rich, but there was a weariness in his tone that belied his youth. She nodded sympathetically, her needles beginning to click. "It must be difficult being so far from home. I understand you left Russia under trying circumstances." Ivan's fingers stilled, and he glanced at her, wary but disarmed by her gentle demeanour. "Yes," he said after a pause. "The revolution made life impossible for artists. I came to Vienna to start anew, but it is not easy to rebuild a name." His voice held a trace of bitterness, and Miss Marple seized the opening. "Lillian Carver seemed to know you well," she remarked, her tone casual. "She spoke so highly of your talent at dinner." Ivan's face darkened, and he struck a discordant note on the piano. "She knew too much," he muttered, then caught himself, his eyes darting to the door. "She mocked my work, said I'd never succeed here. She enjoyed twisting the knife." He rose abruptly, excusing himself, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched as he left. Her suspicions deepened. Lillian's knack for collecting secrets, as Sir Henry had hinted, seemed to extend to Ivan. Had she known something about his past or his present activities that made her a threat? Miss Marple recalled the ledger she had found in the library, tucked behind a bookshelf, its cryptic entries listing payments to an unknown account. The handwriting had matched the threatening note slipped to Sir Henry, and now she wondered if Ivan was connected to both. At luncheon, the atmosphere was strained. The Baroness, presiding with her usual poise, spoke of plans for a memorial concert in Lillian's honour. But her eyes lingered on Carl, who sat silent, his sketchbook closed. Sir Henry, still rattled by the note, avoided conversation, while Dr. Gruber excused himself early, citing work in the greenhouse. Miss Marple, nibbling a cucumber sandwich, engaged Lady Beatrice in talk of music, steering the conversation to Ivan. "Such a passionate young man," she said, "but he seems troubled. Do you know much of his life in Russia?" Beatrice, always eager for gossip, leaned closer. "He was quite the prodigy, Jane, but there were rumours. Smuggling, perhaps, to fund his escape. He's cagey about it. Lillian knew something, I'm sure. She had a way of ferreting out scandals." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Smuggling could explain the shipments Ivan and Gruber had discussed, and Lillian's knowledge might have made her a target. That afternoon, Miss Marple wandered to the library, ostensibly to borrow a book. The ledger was still there, hidden behind a volume of Goethe. She examined it again, noting dates and sums, some marked with initials, IR and FG. Could they stand for Ivan Rostov and Felix Gruber? The amounts were substantial, suggesting a venture beyond mere botany. She replaced the ledger, her mind turning to the greenhouse and its locked door, the chemical odour, and Gruber's burned papers. As evening approached, the guests gathered for drinks in the salon, a prelude to another of the Baroness's attempts to maintain decorum. Ivan was absent, and Miss Marple learned from a footman that he had been seen near the garden shed, a structure she now suspected held more than tools. She resolved to keep an eye on him, but her attention was drawn to Carl, who stood by a window, his sketchbook open to a drawing of a rose with an intricate, almost coded pattern. "Your work is striking, Mr. von Hohenberg," she said, approaching him. "These patterns, are they inspired by the gardens?" Carl started, closing the book. "Just an idea," he said curtly. "I play with shapes." But his eyes betrayed unease, and Miss Marple recalled the maid's account of his furtive visit to the shed. Was he involved in the same scheme as Ivan and Gruber? Or was he, too, a victim of Lillian's blackmail? The evening's conversation was stilted, the guests' thoughts clearly elsewhere. Sir Henry, emboldened by brandy, spoke of his diplomatic work, but his voice faltered when the Baroness mentioned Lillian's connections in America. "She was too clever for her own good," he said, then fell silent. Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, watched Ivan rejoin the group, his face drawn. He avoided Dr. Gruber, who sat in a corner, his spectacles glinting as he studied a botanical journal. As the night drew to a close, Miss Marple lingered in the salon, her knitting a pretext for observation. A servant, clearing glasses, paused near her. "Miss, I heard Mr. Rostov arguing with Miss Carver the day before. You know," she whispered, "in the arbour. He said she'd ruin him if she talked." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind piecing together the fragments. Ivan's fear, the ledger, the shed, the rose patterns. Lillian had known something dangerous, perhaps about a smuggling operation tied to the estate's botanical work. Retiring to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the moonlight casting shadows across the rose gardens. She thought of Ivan's trembling hands, his muttered words about Lillian knowing too much. The pianist's past, she suspected, was not just a tale of exile, but of secrets that had followed him to Vienna. The chemical odour, the locked greenhouse, Karl's sketches, they all pointed to a scheme larger than blackmail. "People carry their past like luggage," she murmured, recalling a case in Chipping Barrows where a musician's charm had hidden a thief's heart. She would watch Ivan closely, for his music, like the roses, concealed a sharper truth. Chapter 6. A Family's Shadow. The fourth day at the Baroness von Hohenberg's estate brought a restless energy, as if the rose gardens themselves whispered secrets beneath their dewy petals. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the guests through the window as they moved about the grounds, their steps cautious, their glances furtive. The murder of Lillian Carver had cast a pall over the gathering, and Inspector Klein's ongoing investigation only deepened the unease. Yet Miss Marple, with her quiet clarity, sensed that the key to the mystery lay not in the stolen diamonds or the jewelled hairpin, but in the tangled bonds of family and ambition that bound the estate's inhabitants. Karl von Hohenberg, the Baroness's nephew, had emerged as a figure of particular interest. His brooding demeanour and cryptic sketches hinted at a man caught in a web of his own making. Miss Marple had noted his tension at dinner, his quick temper when Lillian teased him, and the maid's report of his late-night visit to the locked garden shed. Determined to understand his role, she sought him out after breakfast, finding him in his studio, a cluttered attic room overlooking the rose gardens. Canvases lined the walls, each depicting roses with an almost obsessive precision, their petals interwoven with strange geometric patterns that seemed less artistic than coded. "Good morning, Mr. von Hohenberg," she said, her voice mild as she stepped inside, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Your aunt kindly invited me to see your work. These roses are quite extraordinary." Karl, hunched over a sketch, looked up, his dark eyes wary. "They're just studies," he said, his tone clipped. "The gardens inspire me." Miss Marple peered at a canvas where a rose's petals formed a subtle skull, its lines deliberate. "This one is striking," she remarked. "Almost symbolic. Does it have a story?" Karl laughed, a nervous edge to his voice. "Just a fancy, Miss Marple. I play with shadows." But his hand trembled as he set down his pencil, and she sensed a deeper truth. As they spoke, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the estate, mentioning the Baroness's pride in her brother, Karl's late father. Karl's face tightened, and he muttered, "She never lets me forget him. His legacy, her control, it's all the same." His bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple recalled whispers from the staff about Karl's strained relationship with his aunt. whose wealth tied him to the estate until he came of age. Had Lillian's flirtations and her knack for secrets threatened his fragile independence? At luncheon, the Baroness announced a memorial service for Lillian to be held in the estate's chapel that afternoon. Her composure was impeccable, but Miss Marple noticed her linger near a locked garden shed during a post-meal stroll, her key turning with a practiced hand. The shed near the murder site had piqued Miss Marple's curiosity since the maid's mention of Carl's visit. As the guests dispersed, she lingered in the gardens, pretending to admire a trellis. In the fading light, she saw Carl slip into the shed, emerging minutes later with a small, wrapped package. He glanced around, then hurried toward the house, unaware of her watchful eyes. The memorial service was a sombre affair, the chapel's stained-glass windows casting coloured light on the mourners. The Baroness spoke of Lillian's vibrancy, her voice steady, but Miss Marple noted her fingers clutching a handkerchief, a rare crack in her facade. Ivan Rostov played a mournful piece, his notes heavy with unspoken grief or guilt. Sir Henry Caldwell sat rigidly, his eyes on the altar, while Dr. Gruber fidgeted, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Carl was absent, and Miss Marple wondered if his absence was deliberate. After the service, she approached Lady Beatrice, who was dabbing her eyes. "Such a tragedy, Jane," Beatrice said, "but the Baroness seems determined to carry on. She's so strong." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Strength can hide many things, Beatrice, like a rose's thorns." Her thoughts turned to the shed, the package, and Carl's resentment. Was he entangled in the same scheme as Ivan and Gruber, or was he a pawn in his aunt's game? That evening, Inspector Klein shared a development with the guests, gathered in the drawing room. "We've found traces of a rare toxin in Miss Carver's body," he announced, his moustache twitching as he gauged their reactions. "It's derived from a South American plant, not native to these gardens." Dr. Gruber paled, his hand gripping his chair. Ivan's eyes darted to the floor, and the Baroness's lips tightened. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, recalled the chemical odour near Lillian's body and the vial she'd seen Gruber hide. The toxin, delivered perhaps by the hairpin, confirmed her suspicions of a calculated murder, not a robbery. Later, as the guests retired, Miss Marple lingered in the library, her fingers tracing the spine of a botanical text. She found a passage on South American plants, noting their use in poisons, alkaloids, just as Beatrice had mentioned about Gruber's past. The ledger, still hidden behind Goethe, listed payments that now seemed tied to a darker trade. Carl's sketches, with their coded patterns, might be more than art, perhaps a record of something smuggled through the estate. As she walked to her room, Miss Marple paused by a window overlooking the gardens. The shed stood in shadow, its secrets locked away. She thought of Carl's bitterness, the Baroness's control, and the toxin's deadly precision. "Families cast long shadows," she murmured, recalling a Chipping Barrows case where a son's resentment had led to betrayal. Carl's role was unclear, victim or conspirator. But the shed held answers, and she would find a way to unlock them. In her room, she sat at her desk, her knitting resumed as her mind worked. The toxin, the shed, the sketches, they pointed to a scheme orchestrated within the estate, with Lillian's knowledge as the catalyst for her death. The Baroness's calm, Carl's furtiveness, Ivan's fear, Gruber's expertise, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her resolve firm. The rose garden's beauty hid a poison, and she would expose it, leaf by leaf, before it claimed another victim. Chapter 7. The Garden's Truth. The 5th day at Baroness von Hohenberg's estate dawned with a crisp clarity. The rose gardens sparkling under a thin layer of frost that belied their hidden dew, Asia darkness. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her room with a cup of tea, gazed out at the grounds, her knitting idle as her mind pieced together the fragments of Lillian Carver's murder. The toxin, the locked shed, Karl's furtive package, Ivan's whispered shipments, and Dr. Gruber's burned papers formed a pattern, one she was now certain revolved around the estate itself. The Baroness's cool insistence on a robbery, despite the evidence of poison and precision, suggested a deeper scheme, and Miss Marple resolved to bring it to light. After breakfast, she sought out Inspector Wolfgang Klein, finding him in the drawing room, poring over notes with his meticulous air. "Inspector," she began, her voice soft but firm, "might I share a few observations?" Klein, though initially skeptical of this unassuming spinster, had come to respect her insight after her comment about the snapped rose. He nodded, his moustache twitching slightly. Miss Marple recounted the chemical odour near Lillian's body, the crushed leaf unlike any rose, Karl's late-night visit to the shed, and the whispered conversation between Ivan and Dr. Gruber about a shipment. She hesitated, then added, "The hairpin, Inspector, was no thief's weapon. It was personal, deliberate, and the shed, I believe, holds more than gardening tools." Klein's eyes narrowed, but he jotted down her points. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple," he said. "I'll have the shed searched." She thanked him, her expression serene, but her heart quickened. The pieces were aligning, and she sensed the truth was near. At mid-morning, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice for a walk through the gardens, steering their path toward the shed. The Baroness, overseeing preparations for another evening event, was distracted, her attention on a delivery of flowers. Miss Marple noted her glance toward the shed, a flicker of unease crossing her face. As they passed the arbour where she had overheard Ivan and Gruber, Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire a bloom. The scuff marks on the stone bench were still there, and she spotted a tiny shred of paper, charred at the edges, caught in the ivy. She slipped it into her handkerchief, her mind recalling the maid's account of Gruber burning papers. The shed search, conducted discreetly by Klein's men, yielded a revelation. Hidden beneath a false floor were crates labelled as botanical samples, but inside were vials of a clear liquid, alongside documents detailing exports to obscure firms. The labels bore chemical names, and Klein's chemist confirmed they matched the South American toxin found in Lillian's body. The documents listed payments to IR and FG, with additional entries initialed CVH, Clara von Hohenberg. Miss Marple, invited to view the findings, noted the Baroness's handwriting on the threatening note to Sir Henry, now matched to the ledger she had found. Klein gathered the guests in the library. That afternoon, his demeanour grave. "We've uncovered an illegal trade in botanical toxins," he announced, his eyes sweeping the room. The shed was a hub, disguised as part of the Rose Garden's operations. Dr. Gruber's face drained of colour, his spectacles slipping as he gripped the arm of his chair. Even Rostov stared at the floor, his hands clenched. Karl von Hohenberg, summoned from his studio, looked ill, his eyes darting to his aunt. The Baroness stood rigid, her lips a thin line. Miss Marple, seated quietly, spoke up, her voice gentle but piercing. "Inspector, may I suggest a sequence of events? Lillian Carver, with her talent for secrets, discovered this trade, perhaps through Ivan or Dr. Gruber. She threatened to expose it, likely for profit. The hairpin from the Baroness's collection was laced with toxin, a method requiring Dr. Gruber's expertise. The snapped rose, I believe, was Carl's doing, a moment of rage perhaps at Lillian's hold over him." She paused, her needles clicking. The diamonds were taken to suggest robbery, but the true motive was silence. The room erupted. Gruber stammered a denial, but Ivan broke, his voice raw. "She knew about the shipments," he confessed. "I smuggled toxins for money, to survive. Lillian found out, threatened to ruin me." Gruber, cornered, admitted crafting the toxin under the Baroness's orders, believing it was for research. Carl, trembling, admitted planting the threatening note to Sir Henry to deflect suspicion, having stumbled upon the scheme while seeking funds to escape his aunt's control. The Baroness, her composure shattered, sank into a chair. "I only meant to protect the estate," she whispered, tears brimming. "The toxins funded our legacy. Lillian would have destroyed us." Her ambition, cloaked in the rose garden's beauty, had driven her to orchestrate murder, using Gruber's skills and Ivan's desperation. Klein arrested Gruber, Ivan, and the Baroness, while Carl faced charges for his role in the cover-up. As the police led them away, Miss Marple stood by the window, her knitting resumed. The gardens, once a symbol of elegance, now seemed a silent witness to human folly. That evening, Lady Beatrice joined her, still reeling. "Jane, how did you see it all?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are much the same, Beatrice, whether in Chipping Barrows or Vienna. Greed, fear, loyalty, they leave traces like footprints in a garden." She glanced at the roses, their petals catching the fading light. The truth had been uncovered, but the thorns remained, a reminder of the cost of secrets. Chapter 8. The Quiet Return. The final morning at Baroness von Hohenberg's estate broke with a serene stillness, as if the rose gardens, cleansed by the revelations of the previous day, sought to reclaim their innocence. The frost had melted, leaving the blooms vibrant against the emerald lawns, but the grandeur of the estate now felt hollow, its secrets laid bare. Miss Jane Marple, her suitcase packed with her sensible tweeds and single evening gown, stood by her bedroom window, her knitting bag at her side. The arrests of the Baroness, Dr. Gruber, and Ivan Rostov, along with Karl von Hohenberg's detention for his complicity, had brought the case to a close. Yet Miss Marple's mind lingered on the human frailties that had woven such a tragic tapestry. Downstairs, the remaining guests prepared to depart, their voices subdued as they exchanged farewells in the grand hall. Inspector Wolfgang Klein, his moustache as precise as ever, oversaw the final police procedures, his sharp eyes softened by a newfound respect for the unassuming spinster from Chipping Barrows. He approached her as she descended the staircase, her step light despite the gravity of the past days. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head, "your insight was invaluable. Vienna's police owe you a debt." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes twinkled, though her smile was modest. "Oh, Inspector, I only observed what was there to see. People, you know, are much the same everywhere. Their hopes, their fears, their mistakes." Klein nodded, a rare warmth in his expression. and promised to keep her informed of the trial's progress. She thanked him, her thoughts already turning to the quiet of her village home. Lady Beatrice Ashford, her old friend, insisted on accompanying Miss Marple to the station, her chatter a mix of awe and relief. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said as they settled into the chauffeur-driven car, the estate receding behind them. "To think it was all there. The toxin, the shed, the Baroness's ambition hidden under those roses. How did you know?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, a familiar rhythm. "It's the little things, Beatrice," she replied. "A snapped rose, a whispered word, a glance too long. They tell a story if one listens." The train journey back to England was peaceful, the Austrian countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold. Miss Marple, seated by the window, reflected on the case. The Baroness had built an empire on the rose gardens, her pride masking a ruthless trade in botanical toxins. Lillian Carver, with her sharp tongue and sharper instincts, had uncovered the scheme, her blackmailing sealing her fate. Dr. Gruber's expertise, Ivan's desperation, and Karl's resentment had been threads in her web, each pulled taut until it snapped. The jewelled hairpin, the staged robbery, the coded sketches, all were pieces of a puzzle Miss Marple had pieced together. Not unlike a village intrigue in Chipping Barrows. Back in her modest parlour, the lace curtains casting their familiar patterns, Miss Marple resumed her routine. She tended her small garden, where roses bloomed without the sinister undertones of Vienna's. The village gossip, brought by her maid, was comfortingly mundane. A squabble over a church, feet, a missing cat. Yet, as she dead-headed a rose, her thoughts drifted to the estate, its beauty a veneer for greed and betrayal. The snapped rose beside Lillian's body had spoken of rage, the chemical odour of calculation, the ledger of ambition. "People are their own undoing," she murmured, snipping a wilted bloom. That evening, as she sat by her fire, her knitting needles resumed their steady rhythm. A letter from Lady Beatrice arrived, filled with news of Vienna's shock at the Baroness's arrest. "The papers call it the scandal of the decade," Beatrice wrote. "But I know it was your quiet genius that unravelled it." Miss Marple smiled, setting the letter aside. Genius was too grand a word. She had simply seen what others overlooked, as she always did. The roses in her garden nodded in the breeze, their scent pure and untainted. Yet Miss Marple knew that beauty, like human nature, often hid thorns. She picked up her knitting, her mind already open to the next puzzle life might bring, certain that wherever secrets bloomed, she would find them, petal by petal, in the quiet of her unassuming world.